The path is barely wide enough for one man. Limestone on one side, a sheer drop on the other. A moon that gives just enough light to move by, and no more. The men are not speaking. They are carrying something wrapped in linen, long, dense, heavier than it looks. It used to be a king. This is Egypt, around 1000 BCE. And what happens on this cliff tonight will not be carved in stone, not spoken of in any temple, not written in any record that survives. By morning, the entrance is sealed. For the next 3,000 years, through Rome, through every dynasty and empire that follows, no one will find it. 53 pharaohs, one hidden tomb. 3,000 years of silence so complete, it looks like nothing happened at all. A small group of men, working in secret, gathered the bodies of the most powerful rulers Egypt ever produced, and hid them so completely that 3,000 years passed before anyone found them. Unbelievable. Now, let's go back to the beginning of that night. 600 years passed before anyone built anything significant nearby. That's not quite accurate. The Deir el-Bahari Bey already held the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, that extraordinary terraced structure cutting into the same cliff face that concealed TT320, and it had been standing there since the 18th dynasty. But the civilization that built it, the theological world that gave it meaning, the administrative system that maintained its rituals, all of that was gone within a few centuries of the cache being sealed. The temple stood. The priests who had understood it stopped coming. And the cliff above it, where 53 kings lay in their hidden room, received no visitors at all. The Greeks arrived in force with Alexander in 332 BCE. By this point, TT320 had been sealed for roughly 630 years. 630 years before today takes us to the late 14th century. To a world before the printing press, before Columbus, before the Reformation, before almost everything we consider the foundation of the modern era. That is how long the cache had already been waiting when Alexander's generals rode into Thebes and looked up at a cliff face that meant nothing to them. The Ptolemies who followed Alexander were, in many respects, more serious about Egypt than Alexander himself had time to be. They learned the language, some of them, the early ones especially. They adopted the titulary of the pharaohs. They built temples in the Egyptian style, with hieroglyphic inscriptions that read to any literate Egyptian priest as perfectly orthodox royal dedications. Ptolemy III had himself depicted at Edfu Temple making offerings to Horus with the same gesture, the same proportions, the same ritual logic as Thutmose III had used on the walls of Karnak 1,000 years earlier. The continuity was deliberate. It was also, in some essential way, performed. A ruling family that had come from Macedonia, that spoke Greek at court and conducted its intellectual life through the great library at Alexandria, wearing the visual language of Egyptian kingship because it was the most efficient available technology for governing a population that had organized its understanding of legitimate authority around that visual language for 3 millennia. What the Ptolemies did not have, could not have had, given the nature of the concealment, was any knowledge of what lay in the cliffs above Deir el-Bahari. And this is where I have to be honest about the limits of what we can say. We don't know whether any institutional memory of TT320's location survived into the Ptolemaic period. It's possible, not certain, that some thread of oral tradition persisted within the priestly communities of Thebes, passed from one generation to the next, in the way that sensitive knowledge tends to travel in closed communities, carefully, selectively, only to those who needed it. It's equally possible that the knowledge died with the generation that had it, that the institutional dissolution of the 21st dynasty priestly state was thorough enough to sever that thread entirely. The evidence doesn't tell us. The absence of any Ptolemaic-era disturbance to the tomb, no Greek graffiti inside, no signs of entry, suggests that if the knowledge survived, no one acted on it. Which tells us something, though I'm not certain what. Roman tourists were a different problem. By the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Thebes, which the Romans called Diospolis Magna, had become one of the premier destinations for wealthy travelers making the Egyptian circuit. They came for the monuments, for the sense of antiquity, for the opportunity to stand in the presence of a civilization so old that even Rome looked young beside it. They were not, as a group, reverential. The walls of accessible tombs and temples across Theban region carry Latin graffiti from this period. Names, dates, brief observations. One Roman visitor scratched a note into the wall of the tomb of Rameses VI, noting that he had found the paintings disappointing. Another, at the Colossi of Memnon, wrote a poem, 17 lines, in dactylic hexameter, about the statue made at dawn. They searched too. The Roman period saw systematic, sometimes state-sponsored, extraction of Egyptian antiquities, and the Theban region was understood by this point to be one of the richest archaeological territories in the known world. Roman administrators in Egypt were not naive about the value of what lay under the soil of the Western Bank. Excavations happened, tombs were entered, objects moved, none of it touched TT32. Oh, the Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 CE brought another civilization into contact with Theban landscape and another set of relationships with the ancient monuments. Early Islamic attitudes toward the pre-Islamic past were various and sometimes contradictory. There was genuine scholarly curiosity about ancient civilizations, alongside theological discomfort with their religious content, practical interest in the monuments alongside prohibitions on their veneration. Medieval Arab geographers and historians wrote about the pyramids with careful attention. They wrote about the temples of Luxor and Karnak. They developed theories, sometimes elaborate ones, about the builders of these structures and the knowledge they had encoded in stone. The western bank of Thebes was known territory. The cliff face above Deir el-Bahari was not a secret landscape. Local communities had lived in and around the ancient structures for centuries, repurposing tomb chapels as houses, using mortuary temple courtyards as enclosures for animals, developing an intimate physical familiarity with terrain that European travelers of the 18th and 19th centuries would later describe as remote and mysterious. For the people who actually lived there, it was home. They knew where things were. They knew which cliffs had been worked and which hadn't, which areas had yielded objects in the past and which seemed barren. They didn't find TT32O either. But here is what I think is genuinely underappreciated about the post-ancient history of this site, and it requires sitting with for a moment. The Kurnawi, the communities of people who had lived on and in the Theban necropolis for generations, were not casual observers of the landscape. They were professionals in the oldest sense. Families in the village of Kurna, which had grown up literally on top of and inside the ancient tomb chapels of Theban hills, had maintained active involvement in the antiquities trade across centuries. They knew how to read ground disturbance. They knew which formations suggested human cutting versus natural erosion. They knew, in the intuitive and specific way that comes from generations of exposure, what a sealed tomb entrance looked like when the desert had been working on it for a long time. And still, nothing. The concealment that the priests of the 21st dynasty achieved was not lucky, exactly, though luck played its part, as it plays a part in everything that persists across time. It was skillful. The entrance shaft of TT32O drops vertically into the bedrock, which means the approach from the surface offers no obvious depression, no telltale hollow where a chamber has settled below. The cliff face in the area is genuinely chaotic, fractured, irregular, full of natural recesses and shadowed cuts that look, from any approach angle, exactly like the sealed entrance to a tomb, because the sealed entrance to a tomb was designed to look exactly like them. The priests who chose this location and who dressed the entrance afterward were working with the terrain rather than against it. They were using the landscape's own visual noise as cover. It worked for 30 centuries. By the time European Egyptology arrived in the Theban region in the early 19th century, with Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphics in 1822, opening the textual record of ancient Egypt to systematic reading for the first time, the Western Bank had already been worked over by generations of more or less organized tomb hunting. Giovanni Belzoni, the Italian strongman turned antiquities collector who worked Theban area in the 1810s and 1820s, opened multiple tombs and extracted objects on a scale that would be considered catastrophic by modern standards. He did not find TT32. Carl Richard Lepsius, whose Prussian expedition produced the most systematic survey of Egyptian monuments to that point, mapped Theban necropolis in the 1840s with considerable thoroughness. He did not find it either. What eventually broke open the secret was not scholarship, not systematic survey, not the accumulated expertise of European Egyptology applied to the problem of what lay undiscovered in Theban hills. It was the market. Sometime around 1871, the exact date is uncertain, the family's account of how they found it was naturally self-serving and not entirely consistent across tellings. Members of the Abd el-Rasul family of Kurna found the entrance to TT32. How exactly they found it remains unclear, a detail that still bothers me because I've read the various accounts carefully and none of them fully satisfy as an explanation of the specific moment of discovery. Was it a fall through a concealed opening? A systematic search of a particular cliff section? Something noticed during routine movement through familiar terrain? What is clear is that they understood immediately what they had found, and what they chose to do with that knowledge was not to report it. Instead, they went in. Carefully, selectively. They removed objects, shabtis, papyri, small items that could be introduced into the antiquities market without immediately attracting catastrophic attention. They sold them through existing networks. They maintained the secret within the family. And for roughly a decade, they managed it. But the objects were too remarkable to stay invisible. A shabti bearing a royal name, a funerary papyrus of unusual quality, a piece of royal linen with hieratic script that made no sense if it had come from any of the known tombs in the area. Scholars noticed. Maspero, directing the Egyptian Antiquities Service from Paris, noticed. The thread had been pulled, and the question was only how long before the whole thing unraveled. The answer was 10 years, a decade of careful management, of controlled release, of a family balancing the extraordinary value of what they possessed against the extraordinary risk of being caught with it. Then internal pressure. One account suggests a dispute between brothers, another suggests external coercion. The documentary record is not clear. And the secret came out. Ahmed Abd el-Rasul provided information to the authorities in the spring of 1881. Maspero's assistant, Emil Brugsch, was dispatched to Luxor. He was 31 years old. He had no idea what he was about to descend into. Power in Egypt had always moved through institutions. The throne was the most visible of them, the most photographed by history, so to speak, but it was never the only one that mattered. Beneath it, around it, sometimes quietly sustaining it and sometimes quietly undermining it were the great temple estates. Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, Heliopolis, each with its own landholdings, its own workforce, its own treasury. Each capable, under the right conditions, of surviving the collapse of the government above it. Karnak survived everything. By the end of the New Kingdom, by the time the last Ramessides were losing their grip on the administrative machinery of the state, the temple complex of Amun at Karnak controlled, by some scholarly estimates, close to a third of Egypt's cultivable land. It owned cattle herds, ships, granaries, and workshops. It employed priests, scribes, soldiers, and laborers in numbers that rivaled the royal household itself. The wealth of Karnak was not symbolic. It was material, measurable, and growing across the centuries even as the pharaonic treasury contracted. The man who ran all of this held the title of High Priest of Amun. And I want to be careful about what that title actually meant in practice, because the modern word priest does almost nothing useful here. A high priest of Amun in the late New Kingdom was not primarily a religious figure in the sense that the word conjures, not someone defined by piety, by ritual, by withdrawal from worldly concerns. He was an executive, an administrator of vast complexity. He oversaw the movement of grain, the allocation of labor, the management of temple estates spread across Upper Egypt, and the political relationships with local governors, military commanders, and whatever central government still existed in the north. The religious function was real. He performed rituals, he maintained the theology, he oversaw the festival calendar that structured Egyptian civic life. But the administrative function was the thing that gave him actual power. When the pharaonic state weakened, the high priest didn't seize power in any dramatic sense. He simply continued doing what he'd always done, and what had always been a subordinate function became, by default, the primary one. Herihor was the first high priest to make the implicit explicit. He rose to prominence around 1080 BCE, during the reign of Ramesses XI, the last pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, a ruler whose authority over Upper Egypt had become largely ceremonial by the final years of his reign. Herihor appears in the temple reliefs at Karnak doing something his predecessors had carefully avoided. He is depicted wearing the royal cartouche, not claiming the title of pharaoh outright. The distinction was important to him or to whoever designed those reliefs, but the cartouche was there. A boundary had been crossed, quietly, with just enough ambiguity to provide retreat if the political situation required it, but crossed nonetheless. What strikes me about Herihor, and I've spent time with his inscriptions looking for the seam between calculation and conviction, is how little urgency there is in what he does. He doesn't move fast. He doesn't overreach in ways that would create enemies he couldn't manage. The ambition is real, but it expresses itself through patience, through the slow accumulation of legitimating details, through a kind of institutional confidence that suggests he understood the tide was already moving in his direction. He didn't need to push. He needed not to get in the way. His successors continued in the same direction. By the reign of Pynegem I, who held the high priesthood roughly from 1070 to 1032 BCE, the pretense of subordination to a northern pharaoh had become almost entirely formal. Pynegem I used the royal titulary openly. He had himself depicted in explicitly royal contexts. He was, for all practical purposes, the ruler of Upper Egypt, regardless of what title he used in any given document. And it was Pynegem I and the high priests who followed him who inherited, in the most direct sense, the problem of the royal necropolis. The Valley of the Kings was in their territory. The compromised tombs were their administrative responsibility. The mummies of kings going back to the founders of the 18th dynasty were, by the logic of Egyptian governance, under their protection, or they were supposed to be, and they were failing at it. The ongoing robbery of royal tombs in the late 20th and early 21st dynasties wasn't simply a security failure in the conventional sense, it was a theological emergency. In the belief system these priests administered and embodied, the system they drew their authority from, the destruction of a royal body was a cosmic event, not just a crime. Each mummy damaged, each name defaced, each set of grave goods stripped and sold represented a rupture in the order they existed to maintain. The priests could not rebuild the tombs, they could not restore what had been taken. But the bodies, where the bodies still survived, where enough remained to be gathered and preserved, those they might be able to protect. The decision to consolidate didn't arrive fully formed. This is one of the things I find most humanly recognizable about the whole operation. It doesn't look like a plan so much as a response. A series of practical choices made under pressure that accumulated over decades into something that reads, in retrospect, like policy. One royal mummy is moved because its original tomb has been breached and left vulnerable. Another follows because the logic that applied to the first one applies equally to the second. A temporary location is found. Then the better one fills up, and someone decides that filling it further is preferable to maintaining multiple sites with multiple vulnerabilities. But I should be honest about what the evidence does and doesn't show here, because this is one of those areas where reconstruction and documentation start to blur. The dockets on the mummies give us names and dates and officials. They show us the sequence of moves, the years in which various kings were rewrapped and relocated. They don't give us the meetings, the arguments, the moments of doubt or confidence that preceded each decision. What we can say is that the operation unfolded across roughly a century, from the first documented rewrappings under the early 21st dynasty priests to the final consolidation in TT 32. Oh, and that it involved the active participation of multiple high priests, each of whom extended and completed what their predecessor had begun. Ponegem II, who held the high priesthood until his death around 969 BCE, is associated with the final phase. His own tomb, TT 32. Oh, a private tomb cut into the cliff above Deir el-Bahari, originally intended for himself and members of his family, became the destination. Not a royal tomb, not a purpose-built repository. A family tomb repurposed under pressure into the largest single gathering of royal remains the ancient world has ever produced. The choice of TT 32. O was almost certainly practical. It was in a location the priests controlled directly, it was already prepared, it was in terrain that offered natural concealment, and it was not a place anyone outside a very small circle would think to search. And the priests who made that choice were not, by their own lights, doing something wrong. Here is where I think most retellings of this story go slightly off course. Treating the cache as a solution born of disrespect, as if these kings had been packed away like unwanted objects. The dockets argue against that. The care visible in the rewrappings argues against it. The priests of Amun, operating within the belief system they had administered their entire lives, understood that what mattered was the body, its physical integrity, its identification, the name clearly attached, the lineage recorded, the continuity of identity preserved. A king's mummy in a private tomb in Theban cliffs, properly wrapped and correctly identified, was, by the logic available to these men, better off than a king's mummy in his original tomb, half-stripped, with his wrappings torn open and his name at risk. They were not dishonoring the dead. They were making the only accommodation that remained. What they could not know, what no one in the ancient world could have calculated, is that their solution would work. Not for a generation, not for a century, for 30 centuries. The hiding was so complete, the location so unremarkable, the record so thoroughly suppressed, that every civilization that subsequently occupied Egypt, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Ottoman, passed over it entirely. Armies marched through the Theban hills. Scholars catalogued the accessible tombs. Local families developed deep, multi-generational knowledge of the terrain. Roman tourists scratched their names into the walls of every accessible burial site they could find. And TT 32. O sat sealed in its cliff face, holding 53 of the ancient world's most consequential human beings, for longer than the distance in time between us and the birth of Christ. The priests, in the end, were more effective than they knew. But before we get to what they left behind, before we get to the discovery, the shaft, the corridor, the torchlight, we need to go back to the night itself. The physical, logistical, genuinely difficult night when the last of those bodies were carried up a cliff path in the dark and lowered into the earth. Because that night is the part of the story that tends to disappear inside the archaeology, and it deserves better than that. They chose this place because it looked like nothing. No river access, no fertile ground, no reason for a settlement, a road, or a market. Just a long, narrow valley cutting into the western cliffs of Theban hills, a dead-end wadi surrounded by pale limestone peaks, that trap heat in summer until the air above the rockbed shimmers and distorts. From a distance, it looks like a wound in the earth, something geological and indifferent, the kind of place a traveler would note and then pass. That was the point. The architects who selected this location in the early years of the 18th dynasty, sometime around 1500 BCE, understood something that the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom had learned the hard way across 1,000 years of failed experiments. The bigger the monument, the louder the invitation. A pyramid visible from 50 miles away was not a tomb. It was a treasure map. Every man who looked at it understood what was inside. The question was only how long before someone went in. The valley offered something entirely different. No grand approach, no avenue of sphinxes announcing a burial site, no inscriptions cut into the entrance cliffs to explain what lay behind them. Just stone. And inside the stone, cut by hand into the bedrock at considerable depth, a series of descending corridors and painted chambers designed to hold one body, one carefully preserved, ritually prepared, cosmologically essential body. For eternity. The word eternity is not rhetorical here. The Egyptians meant it literally, in their understanding of how existence worked, and this is a belief system built over millennia, layered and complex and not reducible to any single explanation. The continuation of life after death depended on the survival of the physical body. The body was the anchor. Without it, the other elements of a person's being, what the Egyptians called the ka and the ba, the animating forces that made a person who they were, could not sustain themselves in the realm of the dead. Damage the body, destroy the name, stop the offerings. And in their reckoning, the person ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, not just dead, erased. For a pharaoh, the stakes were even higher. The pharaoh was not, in Egyptian theological terms, simply a powerful ruler. He was the point of connection between the human world and the divine order, the figure through whom the god's will was expressed and the cosmos was kept in balance. His survival in the afterlife was not a private matter. By the logic of their world, it had consequences for the living. The rituals surrounding royal burial were, in this sense, a form of cosmic maintenance. Get them wrong, and the disorder that the Egyptian state existed to prevent would seep back in. This is why they built the tombs so deep, why they filled them with provisions, with weapons, with furniture, with the tools of daily life translated into funerary objects. Why the walls were covered in texts, the Amduat, the Book of Gates, the Litany of Ra, that served as guides for the royal spirit navigating the 12 hours of the night journey through the underworld. Every detail considered, every contingency addressed, a civilization putting everything it knew about death and its aftermath into one underground room and then sealing the door. The Valley of the Kings, at its height, was the most sophisticated burial apparatus the ancient world had produced. And it employed a small city's worth of people to maintain it. The village of Deir el-Medina, tucked into a side valley about 15 minutes' walk from the main necropolis, housed the craftsmen, scribes, painters, and laborers who cut and decorated the royal tombs across roughly 4 centuries. These were not ordinary workers. They were specialists, trained across generations, inheriting not just skills, but knowledge of where the tombs were, knowledge of what was inside them, knowledge of the specific passages cut through the bedrock, which chambers connected to which, and where the doors were sealed, and how. They were, in the most practical sense, the most informed people in Egypt on the subject of royal burial. They were also, and I want to be precise about this because it matters for everything that follows, entirely dependent on the state for their survival. The village of Deir el-Medina received grain rations, fish, vegetables, pottery, and other supplies through the central administration. They did not farm their own land. They did not maintain their own market economy in any significant way. They worked and the state fed them. That arrangement had functioned more or less for the entire New Kingdom period. It began to break down in the reign of Ramesses III. By the reign of Ramesses IX, it had effectively collapsed. The records from Deir el-Medina in the late 20th dynasty are extraordinary for what they contain. Among the administrative papyri from this period are formal complaints, workers documenting in careful hieratic script that their rations have not arrived, that they are hungry, that they cannot work. One document, dating to roughly 1158 BCE, records the first known labor strike in human history. The workers of Deir el-Medina laying down their tools and marching to a nearby mortuary temple to sit in protest until someone paid them. Think about that for a moment. The men who were building the most sacred structures in their civilization, who handled the bodies of gods in their understanding, sitting down on the ground and refusing to move because they hadn't been fed in weeks. The system had not collapsed dramatically. No invasion, no earthquake, no plague had disrupted it. It had simply been mismanaged, starved of resources by a succession of pharaohs whose grip on their own administrative apparatus was loosening year by year. And when men who know where the tombs are begin going hungry, you have created a specific and predictable kind of problem. The tomb robberies of the late 20th dynasty are documented in a group of papyri that rank among the most unsettling administrative records from the ancient world, not because they describe violence, but because they describe something far more ordinary: organized theft. Professional, methodical, conducted by people who had the relevant expertise. The Abbott Papyrus, now in the British Museum, records a formal inspection of royal tombs carried out by officials sometime around 1110 BCE. The language is bureaucratic throughout. Inspectors move from tomb to tomb, note their conditions, record what they find. The tomb of Nebuenenef, intact. The tomb of a minor queen, the outer chambers intact, the inner chamber breached, the sarcophagus dragged to the entrance and stripped. Another tomb, a hole cut through the wall, measuring, the inspectors note, a certain number of cubits in height and width. They measured the hole, they recorded it, they moved on. There is something in that document, in the gap between the weight of what's being described and the tone in which it's described, that I've never been able to fully account for. I've read it many times. I can tell you what it says. I cannot tell you what the men writing it felt, if they felt anything at all, or whether the administrative language was a professional habit or a kind of defense against the magnitude of what they were recording. Both seem possible. What the papyri make clear is that by the end of the 20th dynasty, the royal necropolis had been compromised at multiple points. Not every tomb was stripped completely. The evidence suggests a range of violations, from minor entry and selective theft to more thorough plundering. But the pattern was consistent. The security apparatus built across centuries to protect these burials was failing. The workforce that had maintained it was underfed and increasingly alienated. The state that had funded both was coming apart at the administrative seams. And the mummies, the bodies of kings who had ruled Egypt across 4 centuries, lay in their original tombs, damaged to varying degrees, in a necropolis that could no longer protect them. This is the situation the priests of the 21st dynasty inherited. Not the glory of the new kingdom, the wreckage. The mummy of Ramesses II, still surviving, still in the Cairo Museum, still extraordinary, shows evidence of what came after the initial robberies. His wrappings were disturbed. At some point, priestly hands rewrapped him, added a new linen covering, and attached a small docket, a tag, written in hieratic script, giving his name, a date, and the name of the official responsible for the rewrapping. That's all. No invocation, no prayer for the king's continued journey through the afterlife, or, if there was, it didn't survive. Just a name, a date, an official. The greatest pharaoh Egypt produced, administered like a file in a storage system. But here is what I think we often miss about that docket. It was also an act of care, the only act of care available to people operating in a broken system with limited resources and no good options. They couldn't rebuild the tomb. They couldn't restore the burial goods. They couldn't undo the violation. What they could do was wrap him again, write his name clearly, and make sure that whoever came next would know who he was. The 21st dynasty priests were, in this sense, conservators before the concept existed. What they were about to do with that instinct, the scale to which they were about to apply it, is what makes this story unlike anything else in the ancient world. The path exists today. You can walk it carefully, with proper footwear, in daylight, with the kind of awareness that anyone moving along a narrow ledge above a significant drop should probably maintain. It climbs from the floor of the Deir el-Bahari Bay up into the limestone cliff face above the temple complex, switchbacking where the rock allows it, cutting straight where it doesn't, rising roughly 100 meters above the valley floor before reaching the terrain where TT320 was cut. Archaeologists have walked it, survey teams have mapped it. It is not a pleasant walk in the best conditions. Now remove the daylight. Remove the proper footwear, replace it with sandals or bare feet or whatever a man working a night shift in 1000 BCE wore on his feet when the administration sent him to do something that couldn't be done in daylight. Remove the awareness that comes from knowing exactly where you are and what you're doing, and replace it with the specific anxiety of a man who is carrying something irreplaceable up a mountain in the dark, who understands that dropping it would constitute a failure of a kind that has no administrative category and no clean resolution. Add the weight. A royal mummy of the New Kingdom period is not what most people imagine when they picture a mummy. The popular image, a light, desiccated thing, half hollow, wrapped loosely in pale linen, is accurate for some examples and deeply misleading for others. The most significant royal mummies of the 18th and 19th dynasties were prepared with extraordinary thoroughness. The embalming process filled the body cavities with packing material, linen, sawdust, resin-soaked cloth to maintain the form. Multiple layers of wrapping were applied, each treated with resin, each pressed and smoothed by hand. The outermost layers of some royal mummies were coated with liquid resin that hardened as it cooled, fusing the wrappings into something closer to a rigid shell than a linen bundle. And then there was or coffins, because the most important kings were buried in nested coffins, one inside another, the outermost often of gilded wood, which added further weight and a set of structural complications that would have made carrying it up a steep cliff path a genuinely demanding physical problem. Ramesses II's mummy, when examined by French scientists in 1976, showed the effects of this preparation clearly. Despite the king's own physical frame being relatively slight, he was tall with a narrow build, the features of his mummy still distinct after 3,000 years. The wrapped form was dense, rigid, and not easily managed by a single person. You would need at least 2 men to carry it safely. More if the path was difficult, and the path was difficult. So picture that. 2 men, at minimum, moving a rigid, resin-hardened, linen-wrapped royal mummy along a ledge above a 100-meter drop, in moonlight that was sufficient to see by, but insufficient to trust, in silence, because the one thing they absolutely could not afford was to be observed. Who were these men? The sources don't give us a crew list. I want to be direct about that gap because it's significant. We are reconstructing from physical evidence and logical inference, not from documented testimony, and there's a version of intellectual honesty that requires saying that plainly before going further. What we can reason through is the structure of authority that would have governed an operation like this. The high priest himself, Pine-Gem II, or whichever of his predecessors initiated any given phase of the consolidation, was an administrator, not a laborer. His role was the decision, the authorization, the accountability. The physical work would have been delegated. To whom? Almost certainly to men connected to the priestly establishment at Karnak, trusted figures within the temple hierarchy who had the security clearance, in the practical sense, to know what they were handling and where they were taking it. And almost certainly, given the generations of accumulated knowledge that lived in that community, to men with roots in Deir el-Medina or its successor population, people whose families had cut these tombs, who knew this terrain the way a fisherman knows a coastline. who could navigate the cliff paths in reduced light because they had walked them hundreds of times in full daylight and the geography was already in their bodies. They would have worked in shifts, probably. The consolidation didn't happen in a single night. The dockets on the mummies span decades, which tells us the transfers were spread across a long period, conducted in stages as circumstances and logistics allowed. Some nights, perhaps, only 1 or 2 mummies were moved, others, more. The operation had a rhythm that we can't fully reconstruct, but it was not a single desperate mass evacuation. It was something more methodical than that, more sustained, and in some ways that makes it stranger. Not a crisis response, but a long, careful, ongoing program of covert relocation conducted across multiple priestly administrations, maintained in secret across generations. And then there is the shaft, TT32. O's entrance is a vertical shaft, roughly 10 meters deep, cut straight down into the bedrock before opening into the horizontal corridor below. 10 meters doesn't sound like much until you are standing above it in the dark, holding one end of a rope attached to a rigid, heavy, irreplaceable object, trying to lower it straight down without letting it swing into the shaft walls and damage what you have just carried up a cliff path to protect. Someone had to be at the bottom to receive it. Someone had to manage the rope at the top. Someone, probably more than one person, had to control the descent, feeding the rope slowly, feeling for the moment when the weight shifted that meant the bottom had been reached and the handlers below had the object in their hands. I find myself returning to that image more than almost any other in this story. Not the kings and not the tombs and not the inscriptions. The rope. The specific human problem of a rope in the dark and the people on both ends of it doing something that was simultaneously sacred and logistical in a way that the Egyptian administrative mind may have found entirely natural, but that I find faintly vertiginous to contemplate. Inside the corridor, once you are past the shaft, once the mummy has been received and carried forward, the space is not what you would call welcoming. The corridor of TT320 runs approximately 60 meters into the cliff, turning once before reaching the main chamber. The ceiling is low in sections. The floor is uneven. In the final phases of the consolidation, when the chambers were already filling, the available space would have required careful management, fitting the new arrivals into whatever configuration the existing contents permitted, which was not always the configuration originally intended. Some mummies ended up stacked. Some were placed directly on the floor. The spatial logic of the final cache, when Brugsch entered it in 1881, suggested to him something that he described in a passage I find extraordinarily honest for a 19th century scholar, as resembling a storeroom more than a tomb. Things placed where they fit, not where ceremony would have preferred. But here is the thing that needs to be said about that storeroom quality, because I think it's been misread consistently across the history of commentary on this cache. The priests were not being careless. They were being pragmatic within a theological framework that had clear priorities. The body mattered. The name mattered. The spatial grandeur, the painted corridors, the gilded shrines, the orientation toward the stars mattered in the original context when the resources to maintain all of it were available. When those resources were gone, the hierarchy of what was essential became visible. And what was essential was this: the body, intact, the name, legible. Everything else was context, and context was a luxury the 21st dynasty could no longer afford. The priests maintained the name with particular care. Every mummy that passed through their hands during this period received a docket, a label written in hieratic script on a piece of linen or on the wrapping itself, stating the king's name, sometimes his parentage, the date of the rewrapping, and the name of the official responsible. These dockets are, from the perspective of modern Egyptology, almost absurdly valuable. They are the primary evidence for identifying which mummy belongs to which king, and without them, the attribution of several bodies would be impossible or at least deeply uncertain. The priests who wrote those labels were not thinking about modern Egyptology. They were thinking about what any careful administrator thinks about when managing a complex archive. that the contents must be identifiable, that the record must be legible to whoever comes next, that the system must be able to explain itself. They were writing for a next. They just didn't know how far away that next would be. When the last mummy was placed, whenever exactly that was, in the final years of Pinagem II's administration, or shortly after his own death, the men who had carried out the operation climbed back up the shaft. The entrance was closed. Stone was fitted against stone. The surface of the cliff was dressed to whatever degree was possible to match the surrounding rock. Debris was scattered. The path was left empty. And then they walked away, down the cliff, back into the valley, into their houses, their families, their ordinary days. And whatever they carried in their heads, the knowledge of what was behind that sealed entrance, the specific weight of having handled those particular bodies, the awareness that they had done something that had no precedent and for which no ritual existed, they carried alone. Or they carried it with the few others who had been present. And they did not write it down in any document that has reached us. That silence is not incidental. It was the point. An operation conducted in secret to protect against thieves could not be announced. The concealment was the mechanism. The moment the location was recorded in any official context, inscribed in a temple, registered in an administrative papyrus, mentioned in a letter, the security was broken. The priests understood this. So the knowledge became oral if it persisted at all, and oral knowledge has a half-life that stone does not. By the 22nd dynasty, within a century of the final consolidation, it is possible, perhaps likely, that the number of living people who knew the precise location of TT32O had dropped to a handful. By the 23rd, perhaps to none. The institutional memory that had maintained the secret had itself dissolved. And the secret had become simply true, not protected anymore, not actively hidden by anyone, just lost. A room in a cliff full of kings that the world had stopped knowing about. 3,000 years is not a number you can feel, but you can try to find its edges. When the priests sealed that shaft, the city of Rome did not yet exist. The religion that would eventually place a church over what had been the temple of nearly every subsequent civilization in the Western world had not yet been founded. The language in which I'm speaking to you right now would not emerge for another 1,000 years after that. Every event we typically describe as ancient history, the fall of Carthage, the conquests of Alexander, the reign of Augustus, lay entirely in the future of the men walking down that cliff path in the dark, and the room behind them held still. Brucksch descended the shaft on the morning of July 6, 1881. He had a rope, a candle, and a local guide who had either been part of the Abd el-Rasul operation or was connected to someone who had been. The exact relationship between the guide and the family is one of those details that the official record smooths over in the way that official records tend to smooth over the parts that are complicated. What matters is that someone knew where the entrance was and how to open it, and that Brucksch, a trained Egyptologist working under the authority of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, went down into the dark behind them. The shaft is 10 meters, roughly 33 feet. In practical terms, the height of a 3-story building, straight down, cut into the bedrock with the precision that Egyptian workers brought to everything they cut into stone. At the bottom, the horizontal corridor opens, low-ceilinged, narrow enough that a broad-shouldered man moves through it carefully, extending roughly 60 meters into the cliff before turning and opening into the first chamber. Brucksch later wrote about what he found in that corridor and chamber. He described his state of mind in a published account as something he struggled to name. A kind of mental suspension, he said, in which the professional trained response and the raw human response arrived simultaneously and briefly cancelled each other out. He knew what he was looking at. He had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of discovery, in the abstract sense that every Egyptologist working in the Theban region in the 1870s understood they might, at any moment, encounter something significant. He was unprepared. The corridor was not empty. It was full. Coffins stacked against the walls, funerary equipment piled in the spaces between them, objects of extraordinary quality visible in the candlelight at every point his eye rested. And on the coffins, on the linen wrappings, on the dockets attached to the mummies, names, royal names, written in hieratic script by the priests who had placed them there. Names that Bruges could read because he had spent his professional life learning to read exactly this kind of script in exactly this kind of context. Ahmose, the founder of the 18th dynasty, the king who had expelled the Hyksos, reunified Egypt, and inaugurated the period that produced almost everything we associate with the height of Egyptian civilization. Here, in this corridor, in a coffin that Bruges could reach out and touch, Amenhotep I, Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III, the king whose military campaigns extended Egyptian power to its greatest territorial reach, whose battle records at Karnak fill entire walls, who campaigned in Syria 17 times and is sometimes described by scholars as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, a comparison that flatters Napoleon. Here, in the dark, in a room no one had entered for 3,000 years, and deeper in, around the turn of the corridor, in the main chamber, Seti I, Rameses I, Rameses II. I've tried, a number of times, to write a sentence that adequately describes what it means to stand in a corridor and read those names one after another, not in a museum, not on a reproduction, not in a textbook, but on the actual objects, in the actual space, by candlelight, with the weight of the mountain above you and 30 centuries of unbroken silence around you. I keep arriving at the same conclusion, which is that there isn't one. Some things don't compress into sentences. The corridor held what it held, and Bruges stood in it, and the candle burned, and I don't know what that felt like, and I'm suspicious of anyone who claims to. What he did next has been debated ever since. Within 48 hours, Bruges organized a crew of approximately 300 local workers and removed the entire contents of TT32. Oh, every mummy, every coffin, every piece of funerary equipment that could be moved, loaded onto the bank of the Nile, transferred to a boat and shipped north to Cairo. The speed was, by modern archaeological standards, catastrophic. The spatial relationships between objects, which coffin had been placed beside which, in what sequence the deposits had been layered, what the physical arrangement of the cache could have told us about the order and logic of the consolidation. Most of that information was destroyed in the extraction, lost before anyone had the tools or the time to record it. Bruges's reasoning was straightforward and not entirely wrong. He was afraid. He was 31 years old, operating without significant institutional backup in a region where the local population had already demonstrated, across a decade of careful management, that they understood the value of what was in that cliff. If word spread, and in a community as connected as the Theban Western Bank, word would spread quickly, the risk of looting, of objects disappearing before they could be secured, was real. The logic of rapid extraction was the same logic that had motivated the priests 3,000 years earlier. The best protection is removal, and removal requires speed. He was right about the risk. The archaeology paid for it anyway. The boat that carried the royal mummies north along the Nile left the Luxor area in the days following the extraction. And what happened along the river, spontaneously, without organization, without anyone having announced what the boat was carrying, is one of those historical moments that lands differently depending on how you approach it. And I want to be careful about how I frame it, because the easy reading and the honest reading are not the same thing. The fellaheen along the riverbanks came out as the boat passed. Women tore their hair, men fired rifles into the air. The wailing, the traditional Egyptian expression of grief, unchanged in its essential form from the professional mourners depicted on tomb walls 4,000 years earlier, rose along the Nile as the boat moved north one community after another responding to the passage of something they may not have been able to fully identify, but clearly understood at some level to be significant. Whether they knew specifically what was on the boat, whether word had traveled ahead of it, whether they were responding to the procession itself rather than its contents, the sources don't resolve that fully. But the grief was real. The mourning was real. And I think we have to hold two things simultaneously about that scene: the genuine emotional continuity it represents. People of the Nile Valley responding to the passage of their civilization's dead with the sounds their ancestors had made at funerals for thousands of years, and the colonial fact underneath it, which is that what was passing on that boat was being taken under European institutional authority to a museum in Cairo that the people on those riverbanks would never visit, to be studied by scholars, most of whom would never learn to speak Arabic, in the service of a discipline that would spend the next century and a half arguing about who had the right to the objects and the knowledge they contained. The grief was not simple. The moment was not picturesque. Both things are true, and the easy version leaves out the second one. The mummies arrived at the Bulaq Museum in Cairo, the institution that would eventually become the Egyptian Museum, and Maspero oversaw the unwrapping of several of them in the months that followed. This was standard practice for the period, accepted without significant controversy by the scholarly community, conducted with genuine professional interest and absolutely no awareness of what we now understand about the irreversibility of the process. You unwrap a mummy once, whatever the wrappings contained, the spatial arrangement of the amulets, the condition of the linen at each layer, the evidence of how the body had been treated at each stage of rewrapping is accessible exactly once, and then it is gone. What the unwrappings revealed, even under the crude methods of 1880s examination, was extraordinary. Seti I, whose mummy had been in TT 320 since the early 21st dynasty, rewrapped by the priests after the original tomb was compromised, was found to be in a condition that genuinely surprised the scholars who examined him. The features were distinct. The face of a man who had ruled Egypt around 1290 BCE was legible, recognizable as a face, specific enough that observers described individual characteristics: a strong jaw, a particular set to the mouth, with some confidence. The embalming had been exceptional. The priests who had rewrapped him had maintained what the original embalmers had achieved. 3,000 years had not undone it. Rameses II was similarly preserved, his mummy so well maintained that the French government, when it received him in 1976 for conservation treatment, issued him a passport. The occupation listed King, deceased. He was received at Paris-Le Bourget airport with a guard of honor. The French president's representative attended. A civilization that had not existed when Rameses ruled Egypt paid formal diplomatic respect to his remains because the category of what he represented, the weight of what it meant to encounter a human body that had survived 3,000 years and still carried the marks of the person it had been, exceeded the normal frameworks and required something that at least gestured toward the appropriate scale. I find that passport, and I say this without irony, without mockery, because the instinct behind it seems to me genuinely right, even if the form is slightly absurd, more honest than most of what has been written about this cache. Because what it acknowledges is that these are not artifacts. They are people. Specific, named, once-living human beings who ruled a civilization for centuries, who made decisions that shaped the lives of millions, who experienced fear and ambition and exhaustion and love and loss inside a system that required them to present themselves as divine while remaining entirely human underneath. They are people who ended up in a cliff above Deir el-Bahari because the civilization that had sustained them collapsed, and the men responsible for protecting them did the best they could with what remained. The dockets the priests wrote, those careful administrative labels on linen, turned out to be the most durable thing the 21st dynasty produced. The priestly state itself dissolved. The political structure the high priests had constructed over generations fragmented and was absorbed into subsequent dynasties. The records of their administration, never comprehensive to begin with, have survived only in fragments. But the dockets are there. In the Cairo Museum, on the mummies themselves, in hieratic script that any trained Egyptologist can read. Name, date, official responsible. The minimal, essential information that makes identification possible. An archive that functioned, improbably, across 30 centuries. The priests wrote those labels for an immediate practical purpose, to ensure that the men who came after them, in whatever generation and whatever context, would know who each mummy was. They were writing for continuity. They could not have imagined the specific form that continuity would take. A French scholar in the 1880s, a museum in Cairo, the entire apparatus of modern Egyptology descending on their careful work with cameras and measuring tapes and eventually CT scanners and DNA analysis. But the intention behind the labels and the result of the labels are aligned in a way that feels, when you sit with it long enough, almost like a conversation across time. The priests said, "Here is who this is." Brugsch arrived 3,000 years later and read it. What the priests could not preserve, what no label and no rewrapping and no concealed cliff-face tomb could protect against, was the original context. The painted corridors of the Valley of the King's Tombs, now accessible and partially stripped, preserve the ritual world these kings were supposed to inhabit in death. The texts of the Amduat, the depictions of the solar boat navigating the hours of the underworld, the images of the king being received by Osiris and judged and found worthy of continuation. That world was specific to each king's tomb, designed for that king, oriented toward that king's journey as the priests understood it. The cache gave the bodies somewhere safe to be. It could not give them back the rooms built to hold them. That loss is the thing I find I cannot fully resolve, even after years with these sources. Not because I believe what the Egyptians believed, I don't, and pretending otherwise would be a dishonesty that this kind of history doesn't deserve. But because the intention behind those painted rooms was specific and serious and human in the deepest sense. It was the attempt of a civilization to do right by its dead, to construct a world in which the people who had mattered continued to matter, in which the effort of a life was not simply extinguished at its end. The cache preserved the bodies and erased the context. The priests made the only choice available to them. It was the right choice, probably, and it cost something that can't be recovered. 53 names in a cliff above the Nile. 3,000 years of darkness, a rope and careful hands, and men who walked away without writing it down. The stone remembered what the system wanted to forget, and in the end, the names came back anyway.